There are fragments of Ezra and Nehemiah at the Dead Sea, but no complete manuscript. So the Dead Sea Scrolls doesn't provide the evidence that they were originally one book. The strongest indication that they were one book is the fact that the Ezra memoir, that is the part where Ezra is speaking in the first person, which begins in Ezra chapter 7, is half in the book of Ezra and half in the book of Nehemiah. And so that's a strong indication that Ezra and Nehemiah were originally one book. As we read in Ezra, starting in Ezra 1, we're talking about a time period that begins with the Cyrus decree. And Cyrus is the Persian king who defeats Babylon and takes over all of Babylon's vassals, including the Jews, including Judah. And he issues a decree right away that allows the Jews to return to Judah and Jerusalem. But all of a sudden, in chapter 4, to us, strange shift to the future, to the reigns of King Xerxes, whom we know about through the book of Esther, and then to the reign of Artaxerxes. And we learn there about two occasions where enemies of the Jews try to thwart their fulfillment of God's plan. And then all of a sudden, after chapter 4, verse 23, we got to shift back to the time of Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel. So it strikes us as quite awkward that there is this sudden intrusion into the narrative. A couple of events that actually fit in better chronologically with what we read about in Ezra chapter 7 through the end of Nehemiah, which starts with Ezra, who begins his work in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, which would be 458 BC, and Nehemiah, who comes to Jerusalem in Artaxerxes' 20th year, which would be 445 BC. So how are we to understand this intrusion? Well, sometimes biblical narrative is structured more thematically than it is chronologically. And here's a good example of it. Because even though the Xerxes and Artaxerxes events don't fit in well chronologically with Ezra 1 through 6, it does fit in extremely well with an important theme because, you know, after the Jews begin to rebuild the temple, they receive a lot of hostility from outsiders and also their own lethargy, and so they stop work on the temple until God sends two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to tell them to get to work, finish the temple, which they complete in 516 BC. So I think the original readers would have understood this structure in a better way than we do. We just need to be aware that we get this material in 4:6 through 23 for thematic reasons rather than chronological reasons. Ezra and Nehemiah confronted these Jewish men who had divorced their Jewish wives and then married pagan Gentile women. And they did so, even though it seems so harsh, because this is precisely the issue that got them into trouble in the first place. Now we live in the New Testament time period. Jesus has come. So how does what Ezra and Nehemiah relate to us? Well, the first thing I would point out is that Jesus actually tightens up the law concerning divorce. He teaches that his followers can only get divorce under certain conditions, in particular adultery. You'll remember that when he did, the disciples said to him, But the law of Moses permitted divorce under these circumstances that you're saying we can't get a divorce. Jesus responds by saying that's because your hearts were hard, implying that now that I've come, you can live by a higher standard. Indeed, it is interesting and important to realize that as we as Christians look at the Old Testament law, it still applies, as Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 and following says, not a jot or tittle will pass from the law until it's been fulfilled. So when you ask the question, does the Old Testament law still apply to us today, you have to ask the question for each specific law, because sometimes the law is no longer relevant, like laws concerning sacrifice or food, because Jesus has fulfilled those laws and they're no longer to be observed. Now, of course, the wall of separation has come down, as Paul teaches in Ephesians. There's no longer a wall of separation between Jews and Gentiles as there was during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So certainly there's absolutely no restriction in marrying across, racial lines or ethnic lines or anything like that. But Paul does teach, granted not concerning directly marriage, but it certainly would apply in marriage, that we shouldn't be unequally yoked. So I think that is telling Christians that we shouldn't sort of knowingly marry a non-believer to enter into the most intimate of all human relationships with somebody who doesn't share our very core and most fundamental belief.
以斯拉记当中有两个很重要的主题。第一个主题是提起我们有一位全能的上帝，这位全能的上帝他掌权，他激动了古列王，让他可以让这一群体回到耶路撒冷。以斯拉记里面第二个主题是有关圣洁的子民，因为经过了被掳时代的一些事情，他们被分散在很远的地方，所以圣洁的观念特别的在这本书里面强调。所以在第3章当他们重建的时候，他们很注意到底在哪里重建神的祭坛，圣殿的根基在哪里建造。他们也不允许其他的人参与，因为他们盼望可以借着这方面的重建，可以见证神的荣耀。圣洁的观念又在哪里出现呢？其实出现在以斯拉记的祷告。以斯拉在祷告的当中特别提起这些圣洁的子民是神所赐的种子，用这个种子，其实这也就是基本希伯来文的那个字，其实那个种子也就是后裔。从创世纪第15章，神就要让以色列的子民跟别人也不同。当然这一次回到耶路撒冷的群体，他面对当地的居民跟创世纪的15章所提出来的居民已经不一样了，但是这7个种族的名字还重新出现。其实以斯拉所要强调的就是连续性，神圣经里面的启示是要以色列的子民跟众人不一样。其实以斯拉记里面的所教导的主题对于我们今天的时代有很密切的关系，让我们更加明白神所看重的要我们在婚姻上面的圣洁，信与不信不可以结合。神要我们在婚姻上面小心来处理。
播种国际事工邀请您与我们携手前行，是撒种的有种，是要吃的有粮。了解更多详情，请洽播种国际事工。